Cave Story is a game that is almost legendary in its renown. It can be considered one of the biggest landmarks in terms of indie gaming. Cave Story is proof that even if you are just one person with a dream and an idea, with enough effort, you too can create an amazing game or experience all on your own. After 5 years of working on it in his free time, Daisuke Amaya, or Pixel as he's otherwise known, released Cave Story, or洞窟 Monogatari in 2004, which in Japanese literally translates to something like Cave Story, Cave Legend. It is a beautiful pixel-graphic Metroidvania game, which nowadays seems like a go-to thing that every single indie developer does, and that probably is in large part thanks to how famous Cave Story became. It is an exceedingly polished game with a simple but poignant story. Even though the characters are represented by simple sprites, the amount of personality they managed to cram into such a small package is impressive, which makes it all the more amazing that it is the product of one person from the game design, writing, story, music, everything. To top everything off, Cave Story was released in 2004 completely free for anyone to play and download, even though it had the quality of a solid game that people would probably be willing to put money out for. Pixel just wanted people to enjoy playing this game that he put so much effort into. I cannot say for certain whether Cave Story enjoys similar renown in Japan. As much as I play Japanese only released games and visual novels, I wouldn't consider myself part of the Japanese gaming community. With that said, I think no one can argue that from an international perspective, Cave Story is definitely one of the biggest Japanese doujin games to exist in terms of influence, and I have endless respect for it because of that. Now, let me take this endless respect I have for Cave Story and toss it into the dumpster for now. Because I want to answer the question, nostalgia aside, should you play Cave Story right now in the year 2020? Before I get into answering that question, however, I need to talk a bit about a not so fun topic that I think is necessary to cover. I do have time codes in case you want to skip to me just talking about the game. Cave Story is a completely free PC game that anyone can play, which might confuse some of you who have googled it and found that the Steam page shows a $15 price tag. And that is because, while the original Cave Story is free to this day, the ports, the 3D-ish version, and the Enhanced Plus edition are not. Nicalis is the group responsible for many indie ports, including Cave Story. Cave Story Plus adds one bonus Wind Fortress level, a remastered new and original soundtrack, some challenges, hard mode, and the ability to toggle between the WiiWare and classic graphics. Now, the controversy comes in because the group Nicalis in the last 2 years have been embroiled in, how do I put this lightly, being a really bad company. The founder and CEO has been outed as saying and doing terrible things, ghosting indie developers, bunch of bad stuff. Jason Schreier from Kotaku wrote a whole article on it, which I'll link in the description. More recently, they filed some DMCA claims against Cave Story fan projects, even though many of them are based entirely on Pixel's 2004 version that he made free for anyone to enjoy, and that's just plain scummy. There are rumors that Nicalis took all the money from the Cave Story Plus sales or stole the IP from Pixel, but there just isn't evidence to back those statements up. There's even a tweet from Pixel that says he has received a cut of the profits, at least from the 3DS eShop port. What I'm about to say is with regards to anything, not just this particular situation. I always believe that you should never blindly agree or disagree with what anyone says. Instead, you should do the research so that you come into the situation with an informed opinion, and then decide for yourself what you want to do. As for whether you should pick up Cave Story Plus to enjoy the enhanced features, or stick with the original because of, well, what I just said, that decision I leave to you to decide. I will link a video from a different creator covering this topic, as well as the original Jason Schreier article regarding Nicalis in the description box if you want more info. For what it's worth, I think the original game is still a completely amazing experience. The new soundtrack and new graphics aren't anything too special, and I think really the only thing I would miss is the 60 FPS option, the unlockable curly mode to play the game as curly, and the fun Wind Fortress stage that's a little extra thing. I do not enjoy going to topics that don't pertain to the game itself. At the same time though, if I do know about these things, I think I do have an obligation to at least mention them. Okay, so now that we got that mess out of the way, let's get back to talking about Cave Story itself. As we usually do around here, I'll start off by tackling the premise. Cave Story follows a mysterious robot named Quote who wakes up in a cave. Soon after robbing a gun from the random guy in this cave, this robot stumbles upon the Mamiga village, a peaceful race of rabbit-like beings. With a group of scientists who want to escape the place, a past waiting to be uncovered by our silent protagonist, and a nefarious plot by the ominous doctor that needs to be foiled, that is the basic story of, well, Cave Story. Just to make sure I wasn't completely blinded by nostalgia, I did play the entirety of Cave Story again. And yeah, it was still an amazing time. I played through the Enhanced Plus Edition to check everything that was new to this version of the game. While I didn't think it was going to be a bad experience or anything, it's also been roughly 15 years since I last played Cave Story, so I was perfectly prepared for the fact that perhaps I may have some strong nostalgia goggles on. Luckily, the tight platforming and charming sprite aesthetics renders it relatively timeless as opposed to, say, when Japanese doujin games attempt 3D on a shoestring budget. Going through the stages was still a joy, and the story remains a wonderful experience. With all that said, another aspect I completely forgot about until I played the game was that Cave Story is actually a decently difficult game, especially if you decide to embark on the true ending path. For the average player, especially one who isn't big into difficult precision platforming, the final stretch of the game can be pretty rough. The story, although it looks exceedingly cute and innocent with its robot main character, cute robot girl, chibi Mamiga rabbit people, wholesome enemies that all look very huggable. I mean, one of the main villains is basically a walking suitcase. It actually has some fairly grim moments which I can appreciate. While the story is definitely simple, some of the scenes still pack a punch. It shows that they aren't willing to pull any punches and the story isn't just some happy-go-lucky adventure. While the game is fairly short, and most of the characters only get a handful of lines throughout the story, the main cast remains fairly memorable. The gameplay, while incredibly simple, is designed really well. It's a run-and-gun platformer, with the most unique thing about it being that every weapon has an EXP gauge, which increases by collecting drops from the enemies. Weapons each have levels 1 to 3, however when you get hit, you lose a chunk of your EXP and your weapon usually decreases in level. It's an incredibly simple but very effective design decision. This type of game system really promotes playing through the games relatively smartly, as opposed to just bum rushing through everything, as you want to have high level weapons for the bosses, otherwise you'll walk in and be doing scratch damage to them. Precision movement is the name of the game here, as you have a pretty floaty jump with good air movement, which is really important because the game expects you to jump onto some pretty small platforms and navigate some pretty darn tight corridors. The level design, for the most part, is fantastically laid out. It's designed in a way which really forces players to fully utilize how long they can actually jump, as well as challenge them to deal with enemies at the same time, as players are constantly trying to avoid any damage in fear of de-leveling. Even better, the levels are designed around the many mobility options that you obtain as you progress further in the game. Many areas have places that, even though you visit beforehand, you can't reach until you get the improved movement options. Not just that, they also account for the many different options you might or might not have gotten at that point in the game, whether you have the level 3 machine gun, which gives you a better boost, have the booster, or just have neither of them at all. Enemy variety is also fairly impressive, with every area having their own set of unique enemies, as well as several bosses for the player to tackle, with nearly every single one of them being unique, aside from the 3 rematches you have with Balrog. Every single boss in the game is fairly distinct from each other, both in the visual design of each boss, as well as how each of them fights. I think the only real big complaint I have with the level design is the second area, the grasslands, where it's set up in a way that the first time you play through the game, chances are you will end up having to backtrack throughout the level about 4 times, which feels really bad. You can easily condense it into about 2 runs instead, but you only really figure that out after having beaten the game once already. And that is probably because I imagine that Pixel made Cave Story with the intention that the player plays through the game multiple times, probably at least 2 times. This becomes fairly obvious once we start talking about the last part why I think Cave Story is such a great game, and that's how it treats the player. Instead of hand-holding and giving the player everything from the get-go, Cave Story has a ton of unlockables and hidden secrets that the game hides pretty well and makes the player seek out if they want to get it. While the main route pretty much hands you 3 weapons throughout the story, there are many other weapons that are completely hidden from the player and perfectly missable if they aren't paying attention. There are even some that require the player to do things that wouldn't necessarily be obvious at first glance. For instance, one of the best guns in the game, the Spur, requires the player, when given the option to upgrade his starting gun into the far superior machine gun, to refuse to offer and stick with his Polar Star till far later in the game. Aside from weapons, there are tons of hidden collectibles that are completely optional to collect, and even a true ending to unlock if the player meets all of the conditions required to find it. And I can really appreciate a game that has enough respect for the player to let them discover on their own all of these cool secrets. Both the sense of wonder that the player gets from finding the secret on their own, to the fact that these secrets actually have a tangible impact on the game itself, and are not just random collectibles that exist for the sake of being collected. Now, while I appreciate that Cave Story lets players find everything on their own, and I think it's super cool that it does it, I don't like the fact that some of these collectibles are a little ridiculous to find. For instance, Curly Mode, which I think is one of the more interesting additions to Cave Story Plus, is unlocked by finding a hidden collectible in the second room where Curly is at. However, I don't really understand how a player is supposed to know to jump into this random piece of the wall in the room, unless they are actively checking their map in every single location they're at, which I don't think most people are. It made sense in the original because the item did nothing and was just a dumb collectible, but in Cave Story Plus, it's a requirement to unlock what is probably one of the more interesting additions to the game, so it probably needed more hints or something. Another fact I didn't like was that it's basically impossible for the player to realize what the first requirement is for the true ending on your first playthrough. Spoiler warning, obviously. Feel free to skip to me talking about Cave Story Plus additions if you haven't played Cave Story yet and want to come in completely blind. But the fact that the player has to intentionally not get the 0.8 booster from Professor Booster is something that no player is ever gonna do on a first playthrough, ever. Of course, you're gonna talk to the old man who fell from the sky and plopped on the ground, especially since there is a clear platform which looks like it requires it. And if you don't skip Professor Booster at this point, then the rest of the conditions to get a true ending never open up, like getting the tow rope to save Curly during the drowning sequence. The game also just never even reveals the fact that this true ending exists, rather you're just supposed to extrapolate it yourself from the fact that you get the 0.8 booster and there's a comment how it's a prototype, and if Professor Booster was alive, he'd make the 2.0 booster. But I feel like the idea that not talking to the old man who just fell to his death miraculously means he doesn't die later doesn't make a lick of sense. It'd be more believable that instead you might have missed an item earlier, before that moment, that you need to give to him so that Professor Booster doesn't die. It feels very counterintuitive, which might have been the point to make it very hard for the player to find out, but still. While I'm on the spoiler train, I also think it's fairly dirty that the game even gives the option to leave Curly in the house during the true ending route, because the only reason that option exists is to block the player from getting the ending. While the difficulty of Cave Story has a pretty solid curve throughout the entirety of it, where it will challenge those who have only dabbled in platformers, the final area that makes up the true ending is a huge difficulty spike that is way harder than the rest of the game. Which, yeah, I guess that's why it's a secret and it requires a bunch of conditions to access it, but dang is it tough. Don't get me wrong, I enjoy the challenge and I think it's a ton of fun that feels suitably epic for the finale of the game. I've also done some speedruns to try and complete the time challenges. That said, I feel like if you are already struggling throughout Cave Story as it is, this part might be extremely intimidating and take you a long time to actually ever complete, since the game forces you into a huge gauntlet of enemies, obstacles, and traps that is the hardest the game ever gets. I also think it's fairly cool that the game has unlockables for speedrunning the final area, and achieving the last unlockable of under 3 minutes requires some very strong mastery over the final level. Finally, let's talk about all the new stuff present in Cave Story Plus, as opposed to the original 2004 Cave Story freeware version. I have already mentioned that I only find 2 or 3 things actually of any note, but let's go over all of it. First, obviously, there is new graphics as opposed to the original ones. They are slightly more detailed and that's pretty much it. I'd say only Curly and Quote have a fairly noticeable difference. Outside of the characters, the areas are completely the same. There is a remastered and new soundtrack, both of which I won't say are better, just different. The original soundtrack is already such a charming chiptune that it doesn't really pale in comparison to the others. There is a hard mode, which all it does is remove missiles from the game and remove all HP upgrades, so that the player is stuck at the minimum 3 HP throughout the entirety of it, outside of one near the very end, forcing players to basically never get hit. There are also a couple of challenges, most of which I found ultimately kinda pointless. Machine Gun Challenge is a boring, easy level meant for speedrunning. Nemesis Challenge is a bit more interesting and challenging, but again, I'd rather try and get better Sanctuary times than do any of these two. Speaking of which, there is Sanctuary Time Attack, which just lets the player go through the final stage, but customize the MC however they want. Cool, but ultimately again, kind of whatever. Boss Attack Mode is a cute idea, but the game is already a pretty short experience already, and it doesn't take that long to just play through the game. I also can't imagine ever playing through it more than once. Finally, as for the two things I actually really like, Cave Story Plus adds the Wind Fortress level, which was supposedly going to be an original game but was taken out. Wind Fortress is a challenging, fun level that really makes the player fully utilize the booster to its maximum potential, all the while tossing tons of enemies at you. Super fun, has some unique enemies with the evil Curlies, and even a new boss fight near the end. The other addition that I found compelling was again Curly mode, where once you get her underwear during any run, you unlock this mode of the game, where it's the exact same game except Curly is now the main character instead of Quote. It's cute, mostly because Curly, being the sociable lady that she is, actually has added lines where she talks to all of the characters, as opposed to Quote, who is a silent protagonist. I think these two scenarios and the 60 FPS are the three things that Cave Story Plus adds to the original 2004 freeware version that I would actually miss. Wind Fortress is fun even if it's just like a 20-minute experience to finish, and Curly mode is a cute addition to the game. As I said in the very beginning, Cave Story is a legendary doujin game that really inspired the indie game scene to what it is today. The story of how even just one guy on his own can create such a fun, well-made and beloved game is something completely awe-inspiring. It's obviously not the first doujin game or anything like that, but it was one that received such international renown beyond just Japan, and even in Japan, for one person to make the entire game on his own, from the music to the game design, story, art, characters, and everything, is an absolutely ridiculous feat. What I want to talk about throughout this video, however, is that even beyond its well-deserved reputation and cultural impact, that Cave Story itself is a game that can be played and enjoyed even in present day. Even with all of the other indie Metroidvania kind of games that have come out throughout the past 16 years, Cave Story still stands out as something special all on its own. The tight gameplay, the charming pixel aesthetics with a simple but moving story underneath it, and the huge wealth of secrets for the player to discover, all of it, even when viewed with the standards of today, is still an amazing experience that if you haven't played Cave Story yet, please give it a shot. Find out why people were so inspired and awed by it all those years ago. The original Cave Story released in 2004 is still free to this day for anyone to download, and works perfectly on modern computers, which isn't something that is always a guarantee with these older games. If the new additions I talk about were of interest to you, Cave Story Plus exists out there as well. As always, if you enjoyed me rambling about these games, the like button is down there as always. Subscribe if you want to support the channel, notification all buttons to keep up to date on when the next video comes out. Now, if you will excuse me, I need to go fetch my endless respect from the dumpster, so till next time! Now where the heck did it go? I had